Grace and peace to all, and welcome to our Holy Week chapel service. It's good to see you in here today. I want to thank all our liturgists and readers today, Jessica Acosta, Nathan Null, Jessica Hawkinson, and Katie Jenkins. They'll be hard at work today. And Carolyn, thank you for your music. Angela Baumann's going to accompany her on the violin. And Dan Ott is here somewhere. He will provide you some special music at the end. Let me share a few announcements. You'll see on the back of the bulletin, it's hard to believe, but we're getting closer and closer to the end of the semester. We really just have the month of April for our chapel services, and you can see who's giving the message through the end of the semester. I also want to make you aware that we are having a celebration of the life and legacy of Professor Ira Smolensky this Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. in the CSB's Mellinger Commons. Everyone is welcome to attend. It's going to be an informal reception with food and drink, sharing stories and toasts. And Professor Smolensky really died unexpectedly for our community on March 1st, and we are looking forward to this time to honor his life and his legacy among us. That concludes our announcements. Well, I wanted to just say a word about today's service. We are going to be moving through the scriptural narrative of Jesus' journey to the cross. So it's a service of readings and music. You'll notice the lights dimming as we go, and we conclude the service in a traditional Good Friday Tenebrae moment of darkness. And I've always believed that you can't fully appreciate the joy of Easter Sunday resurrection until you've experienced the death and the darkness and the hopelessness of Good Friday. And so that's the tone of this service. There will be no blessing at the end, no music at the end, and we just ask that you respectfully leave the chapel today in silence. But we appreciate you being here, and there will be no chapel next Monday because the college will be on our Easter break. But I do encourage you to find a worshiping community to celebrate Christ's resurrection. And now I invite you to join me in prayer. Merciful God, open our minds and our hearts to receiving your word today. Save us from any hardness of heart that might lie within us, so that as we experience Christ's final days, we might also repent, confess our sin, and receive your abundant, unconditional love. Bless us in this time of worship as we follow Christ to the cross. Amen. Now I invite you to stand, and we'll be singing hymn number 223, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross.
For today's reading, we remember how 6 days before the Passover, Jesus entered Bethany, where Lazarus, so recently raised from the dead, was living. Lazarus and his sisters invited Jesus to dinner at their home. Martha served. Lazarus was one of those sitting at the table with them. Mary came in with a jar of very expensive aromatic oils, anointed and massaged Jesus' feet, and then wiped them with her hair. The fragrance of the oils filled the house. Judas Iscariot, one of the Jesus disciples, even then getting ready to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this oil sold and the money given to the poor? It would have easily brought 300 silver pieces." He said this not because he cared 2 cents about the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of their common funds, but also embezzled them. Jesus said to Judas, "Leave her alone. She's anticipating and honoring the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you. You don't always have me."
On Tuesday of Holy Week, we read and remember how Jesus' soul was troubled as the day of his death approached. "Now my soul is troubled," Jesus said. "Yet what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven. "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." The crowd that was standing there heard this voice and said that it must have been thunder. Others said, "An angel has spoken to him." But Jesus said, "The voice didn't come for me, but for you." At this moment, the world is in crisis. The ruler of this world will be thrown out. And I, as I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death he was going to die. But the people in the crowd answered him, "We heard from God's law that the Messiah lasts forever. How can it be then that the Son of Man must be lifted up? And who is this Son of Man?" Jesus said to them, "The light is with you for a little longer. Walk while you have the light, so that the darkness may not overtake you. If you walk in the darkness, you do not know where you are going. While you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become children of the light."
Wednesday of Holy Week, we read and remember how Jesus singled out his betrayer. While eating the Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus became visibly upset and then said, "One of you will betray me." The disciples looked around at one another, wondering who he was talking about. One of the disciples, the one Jesus loved dearly, was reclining against him, his head on his shoulder. Peter motioned to him to ask who Jesus might be talking about. So he said, "Master, who?" Jesus said, "The one to whom I give this crust of bread after I've dipped it." Then Jesus dipped the crust and gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. After Judas received the piece of bread, Satan entered him. Jesus said to Judas, "Do quickly what you are going to do." And no one at the table knew why Jesus said this to Judas. Some thought that since Judas was their treasurer, Jesus was telling to him to buy what they needed for the feast, or that he should give something to the poor. But Judas, with the piece of bread in his hand, immediately left the room, and it was night.
On Maundy, Thursday, we read and remember how Jesus ate his last Passover meal with his disciples. During this supper, Jesus, knowing that he had come from God and was going back to God, got up from the table, set aside his robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the feet of the disciples and dry them with a towel. When he got to Simon Peter, Peter said, "Master, you will never wash my feet." But Jesus said to him, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter responded, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "If you've already bathed, you only need to wash your feet now. My concern is holiness, not hygiene, so now you are clean." After he had finished washing the disciples' feet, he took his robe, put it back on, and went back to his place at the table. Then he said, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You address me as teacher and master, and rightfully so, for that is who I am. So if I, the master and teacher, washed your feet, you must now wash each other's feet. What I've done, you do. My children, I am only with you a little longer, so I give you a new commandment, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also should love one another."
Jesus.
Finally, on Good Friday, we read and remember how Jesus and his disciples left the upper room where they had eaten together, went across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden. Judas, his betrayer, knew the place because Jesus and his disciples went there often. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came to the garden with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, went out and met them, asking, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." Simon Peter, who was carrying a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave, cutting off his right ear. Jesus said to Peter, "Put away your sword. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him.
They took Jesus to Pilate's headquarters, the Roman governor. Pilate came out to them and said, "What charge do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." But the Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." Then Pilate summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you asking this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your people and your high priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered him, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate went out to the Jews and told them, "I find no case against this man. It's your custom that I pardon one prisoner at Passover. Do you want me to pardon the king of the Jews?" The people shouted in reply, "Not this one, but Barabbas." Barabbas was a bandit.
So Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. They kept coming up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews," and striking him in the face. Then Pilate handed him over to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to the place called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them.
Pilate also had a sign written and put it on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read the sign because the place where Jesus was crucified was right next to the city. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them up 4 ways, to each soldier a 4th. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit.